Welcome back, everybody. Nick, who was our guest today?
Our guest today is Samuel Cohn. He is a sociology professor at Texas A&M, and he got his PhD from the University of Michigan. Brendan, what are some of the topics that we discuss?
We talk about, honestly, just the nature and the social dynamics that exist within the world. That's the best way I can put it. And man, we get into some a combination of frightening but really interesting topics.
We do. So Dr. Cohn recently authored a book titled All Societies Die, How to Keep Hope Alive. And so we go in depth about like why past civilizations, why past societies have demised, and some of the factors that led into that, and some of the things that are on his scope today for our society. And man.
And the subtitle of that book, which was the best piece of it, was just keeping hope alive.
Yes.
I think that's an important message going forward through this conversation is we're not a hopeless society. We have so much we can still accomplish and offer. And I think that's a great piece of the message.
Yes, definitely. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Sit back, relax,
and enjoy the show.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cohn, for spending this time with us today. Brennan and I are pretty excited about this conversation as it's not a topic that we've dove into yet. But yeah, we like to begin by just having you share a little bit about your background, a little bit of your story about how you got into this work and the interests that you have today.
Okay. I'm a sociology of development person, emphasis on long-term historical. My primary interest has been getting rid of global poverty. I founded and was the first president of the American Sociological Association section on development. They didn't have a global anti-poverty unit before I came. There's now about 600 people in that group. That said, you do your academic work and professors publish their papers and talk about all important social issues. It's what we do. But I could not help noticing that I was starting to get a little bit old. If you notice the color of the hair, I don't think I could pull a romantic lead role in Hollywood these days. Noticing myself aging and noticing the stupid little aches and pains that old people start getting. Well, when you're a sociologist, you know about the deep link and parallels between individual personal life and larger global systems. And so I began to wonder, gee, if this is happening to me, does it happen to societies or civilizations in general? And so I started doing some very simple things. I know how long human beings live. I started to look and see how long societies live, how long empires live, how long world systems live. And a very scary calculation came up. The longest anyone has really lasted for society is about 900 plus years, which was a sequence of very, very prosperous dynasties in China. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom of Egypt, they ran much shorter, between 400 and 600. Rome kind of squeaked it out till about almost 900. They were one of the long ones. A lot of societies like Alexander the Great's empire, one-star wonders. They died nearly after the immediate creation. Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. Looking at the average for the success, ones that weren't infant mortality, that died on birth. The ones that made it, they ran from about 400 to 900 years, mostly around 600 or so. If you date our current society, which is unlike others historically, is multi-nation, started in Western Europe. The dominant nation moved around a number of times from Spain to Holland, Britain, moved to the United States, which became the hegemonic power, but it was all largely one Atlantic-based system. Call it the Atlantic modern world system. There are other scholars with similar names. Sociologists will recognize Emanuel Wallerstein's world system concept in that. We date from about the end of the Middle Ages, so that early economic activity starting in Flanders, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parallel developments in northern Italy, that took place late 1300s. Well, my calendar says it's 2021. That puts us at 1350 to 2021, 600 years plus old. By historical standards, we are middle-aged. Now, as human beings, like when you're 20, when you're 30, when you're invulnerable, when you're 17, driving the car whichever way you want, you never think you're going to die and you never think you're going to get sick. And when we talk about that, we pretend this is some sort of extraordinary event, like a nuclear catastrophe, or we often have environmental models. There's global warmings that kill us all, something like that. But there's not a concept that people have that societies normally die of their own weight, that something tends to take everything down. And certainly, imagine an old person that wasn't taking care of his health. He was continuing to smoke, continuing to drink, continuing not to exercise, et cetera, et cetera. You know that old guy dies a lot more than someone who's getting his regular checkups, taking his pills, catching all the diagnoses before they get that. And certainly there is no global discourse or even national discourse on how do we keep society alive? What do we need to do to survive in the long term, with the possible exception of the environmental issue? Environment is just one way we die. That'd be like someone who takes care of heart disease and smokes like hell because cancer is not even on their radar. And so we're doing what we can not too effectively about environmental causes. None of the other causes are being taken care of. So the likelihood of some kind of natural death is in fact quite high. And since it's happened historically many, many times, this is not unprecedented. You don't have to imagine a Hollywood scenario or something out of a science fiction movie where the planet blows up. We tend to have very spectacular views of how these things happen. It's like, imagine people thought that the only way you die is the way people die in Hollywood. So in a gun, 88 bullet gunfire, like Bonnie and Clyde, or you blow up with a whole, you remember, whenever something explodes in Hollywood, the flames always go up 3 stories. Well, that's Hollywood. A lot of people just die in their sleep, in bed, having soiled the sheets over a long, long period of decline where they were pretty moribund for a pretty long time. That's the way that most societies die. You don't get the big glamour end. You can't even date when it happened, but just things seem to be getting worse and worse and worse until they're really, really bad. What day did the Middle Ages start? It didn't start on a day. It just happened. But by 600 AD, life was much, much worse than it had been in 100 AD. And that's the kind of thing that is a realistic prospect for the Western European, American, global world system, and all the nations that are kind of prospering for being under that umbrella, the Chinas and the Egypts and everyone else would be involved. So starting from my personal health, I saw the larger macro picture. Seeing that, I got scared. So that's when I started looking into the issue.
That's so fascinating. One of the first things that comes to mind when I hear you talk about this, correlation between personal health and societal health is, that's quite the undertaking to consider. I mean, because like you mentioned, human beings don't recognize their slow progression towards their death. And a lot of times it's a very difficult thing to undertake a solution when you don't recognize a problem, or your society's built on, this idea of like, what's the silver bullet solution that's going to fix this right here, right now? Nobody has that long-term perspective, which is what I love about what you've done is you've identified these trends that really impact and are signals from the past almost of these long-term things to look out for. Do you feel like at this point there is a realistic reversal or solution that's out there, or is it more of like hedging our bets toward, and once we see that this is coming, just be ready to like reemerge anew? How do you kind of see the long-term playing out of this happening?
There are many different options.
Of course. Yeah.
later on, I could, but individuals make a difference. Okay. And macro sociology is full of surprises. Ask any credible political scientist, sociologist, or economist what American politics or world politics would have looked like in 2018 when they were in 2000 and no one envisioned the rise of Trump. So there are huge paradigm shifts that occur, and they can often occur very quickly. So the idea that there's this long-term destiny and we're all going to die and there's nothing we can do about it, that's silliness.
Yeah.
Okay? No one would have expected that slavery would be abolished, that a bunch of nutty religious reformers in England in the 1700s would actually win, and worldwide something that had been in history from the beginning would disappear. So never say never on anything. No one would have envisioned women's liberation. Inconceivable in 1700. That said, let's talk about the number one fact involved. So just like imagine that a patient comes in, he's smoking, he's drinking, he's not exercising, and he's not dealing with his diabetes and chowing down the sugar. So people can immediately see all the scenarios and know that there's got to be some, and he's stubborn. He's really stubborn. And that's what we're like. The number one thing that allows a society to live is widespread cooperation. Some of this is at not at the center level, but the global level. So if you think about a great success you can think about, I'll give you two great successes that worked globally. One is the internet. No one had to regulate it. No one had to make any rules. Governments were involved. Like, the Defense Department invented the technologies that became the internet. But, it kind of happened spontaneously, and everyone wanted this to work. Certain things like traffic, you have traffic, so you have a system. There's red will mean red, stop, and green will mean go. And everyone kind of signs off on that. Well, that was pretty easy to do. Frankly, although there's controversy about this, capitalism, and yes, progressive listeners, with all of its faults, and we can list the 7,633 problems with capitalism, acknowledging the massive downsides, which could be 17 broadcasts on Armchair Scholars. No other economic system has produced as large an increase in standards of living, GDP per capita, calories per capita, which means no starvation, or reduced infant mortality. So on some very real indicators of human welfare, kind of sort of the free market system with all of its many problems is squeaking along. And note that that's a global system of cooperation, trade across government lines. Self-interest being the larger system behind it. People just do it because, hey, this is a good economic deal. I can go to work for these guys, make some money. So taking the gold standard as global systems of cooperation with both strong governments helping out, if you look at the history of capitalism, or for that matter, even of the internet, certain amount of what governments did helped out, and governments made real contributions to make all of that happen, like regulating financial fraud, putting in a system of money that was durable, setting up a system of enforceable contracts. Government did that. investing in some of the infrastructure it would take to get trade moving, like building some ports so we could do some international trade. A combination of government being strong and active, taxation, what? People paying for enough government services so the government can do its job. Our modern society is based on technology, right? Technology comes from education. Education, while there are private schools that exist, I've heard people tell me that Harvard and Stanford are continued to be considered to be good schools. They're private sector. I've heard that there's some private schools for younger children that are really good. But allowing for that, making sure that the world population is literate, numerate, knows technology, knows how to drive, lots of things like that. This is all public education paid for by the government. You could not imagine us having the technological level of today without massive education. In fact, when people ask, well, why is America the number one technological superpower in the world, which it is? America is the number one superpower in the world technologically because historically we led the world in the percentage of our population that was college educated. It's not that Americans are smarter than Germans or smarter than Russians or smarter than Chinese, although we like to think so. Americans, we're just the superhero thing. We're all intellectual combinations of Albert Einstein and Bruce Willis and Die Hard. We can't be beat. We're tough. We're so smart. The reason that we had all of those people college educated was we were the only places that built state universities. University of Texas, University of California, University, North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Although most people don't realize this, Cornell is actually the State University of New York at Cornell. Half of that's public, including the best agriculture school in the world and some of the best, there's many things that they do that the government pays for. No one else was put in. We gave GI Bill, we gave all the GIs free college educations. No one else was doing that. So because we had that much more of an educated labor force, technology and technological innovations just came faster and were more widespread, and our labor forces were more productive. That's all government. Got to pay for that. Anyone who's been around a school bond issue where there's an election for school bonds and all the senior citizens say, I don't want to pay, I don't have any kids. Okay. And as you know, anti-tax is a big deal now. But that cooperation of citizens working together, the state doing its job and the state having money to do its job is the secret of growth and survival. Now, when you start fighting among yourselves, it's black versus white, red state versus blue state. We can't even cooperate enough to stop a pandemic when everyone knows how it's done. That's a pretty low level of collective functionality.
It was terrifying how quickly the pandemic became a just purely political issue.
Absolutely. Well,
please go ahead.
No, you're talking smart here. Keep going.
I was just going to say, too many people were willing to discredit public health policy because it was coming from a president they didn't like. And maybe some of it was really bad advice, but maybe in there, some of it was good advice. But we were willing to throw out the baby with the bathwater on all the advice coming from one side. And that was, I'm not going to claim to have had the answers to how this whole thing should have been dealt with, but I would never say that one side had 100% wrong answers to the solution, but that was just seemed to be the unfortunate consensus that came about, especially through the media.
Your analysis is really good. So I should be interviewing you. You should be interviewing me. But seriously, let's just take what you're doing, because you mentioned a critical element of what's happening that I did not talk about, but you're dead on accurate. Respect for expertise. Now, it is not the case that the experts always know. You can buy 9 million books about how experts have blown it and the number of historical examples, but of experts blowing it is long standing. But in general, experts know more about things than do amateurs. And there is not, and this is not just red state, blue state. We like to pretend that blue state people always get it and red state people are so dumb. Note that that is exactly the attitude that's killing us. The idea that red state people are so dumb, so we're not going to listen to them. Hate to say it, blue staters, you are guilty as charged and you're as bad as they are. Anyone who thinks that no one in Alabama has ever had a good idea, or think that everyone in Alabama is just like the political grotesques who grab the microphone because they're taking an extreme position, that is exactly the kind of contempt that keep people from working together. So the latte crowd is as dangerous as anyone else. Or the people who, okay, taking that aside, even the latte crowd was more and more suspicious of science. So you have all these postmodernist people of the subjective nature of reality, people who want to avoid hard science courses. They don't want to do math and they think that scientists are no good. People who don't want to follow their doctor because the doctor tells them they have to quit smoking. Or realistically, the ecologist tells you you have to use less energy, which means reducing the air conditioning in your house and the driving you do. So there's as much delegitimation in Santa Monica, California, as there is in Mobile, Alabama. And that common lack of respect for authority is one of the features, one of the features that undercuts effectiveness. Government can do things effectively two ways. You can either spend money and build something, no taxes, they can't do that. Or it can provide a bully pulpit and provide moral leadership. Winston Churchill getting up and inspiring us all to win World War II. If you're not going to listen to either two sources, then the number one agency you have for solving the problems of society and the world has been undercut. Like Rome in 300, the government was pretty much ineffective and undercut. Byzantium, when the decline started to call it ineffective and undercut. You look at all the histories of the empires or the governments before the revolutions in the last decades or century is increasingly ineffective leadership in government where they're bumbling through often because they can't or no one's listening to them. And so then people just get rid of the thinking it's a bad joke. We're setting that up. And it's not just the US, it's occurring globally.
So I know that there are several different factors that will play into this, and it's something that's occurring over a long period of time. But how did we get here? What are some of those major themes as to why this is becoming a serious issue today?
You guys are really good. Really good. Okay. I've given a bunch of interviews and no one has asked that super intelligent question. So give Armchair Scholars a gigantic A. And you can put that quote on your website. Okay? What happens? And it's like a lot of tragedies. Where you have the good man doing something, but he commits one or two tragic sins that he thinks are going to be no big deal. And they come back and they haunt. And the consequences build and build until you have a problem. There are several things that occurred in the history of the Atlantic world system that led to deep contradictions in permanent negative capacities. But I'll just talk about just one, because let's talk about, I think, the tax and anti-legitimation factor. Okay. And there these are not my ideas. They come from other famous scholars. But, sometimes, as I was saying, sometimes you want to listen to authority. Sometimes great academic authorities have great ideas that you can use. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. One factor was identified by a Marxist scholar named James O'Connor, who came up with the shocking argument that no one will believe that the conservative middle class is the true revolutionary class in capitalism. And, because Marxists think it's all about the working class, it's all about unions, and everything has to look like the Soviet Union in 1917. And the working class people are progressive, and it's only the bourgeoisie always want to keep the system going. They couldn't get past their 19th century textbooks to see the rise of a large, mobilized, conservative middle class as being the dominant political agent in capitalism. This is global. It's in India and Modi. It's in all of the right-wing governments occurring in Europe. Even traditional social democratic places like Denmark and Switzerland are picking up anti-immigrant moves that are turning toward this. And there was a rising move even in Europe in the 1980s for shrink the state. Now, where does this come from? It comes from taxation. And traditionally, liberals, I don't deal with taxation. We just pass whatever. We're to tax all the rich people. No, by taxing all the rich people, all the people you're talking to aren't going to have to pay for, right? So this is another one of these claims that you don't have to contribute to the common problem. We'll make someone else do it. That's all right. Everyone has that. But that concept of I don't want to pay, let's let someone else pay, starts with where we're getting nobody wants to pay. But the way that taxation works under most capitalisms, and the United States is far worse on this than Europe. Europe is not as advanced in this regard as we are. So that's why we have Trump and they have stuff that's less. Boris Johnson may be Boris Johnson, but he's not Trump. We're kind of leading the way on that one. Our tax system is largely paid for by small business and rich individuals. You think, what? Well, poor people have no money. So you're not going to get many taxes out of them. Large corporations have the tax code written so that they legally don't have to pay any kind of large share of their profits and taxes. So remember, tax Amazon. No, you can't tax the internet. The internet should be free. And Amazon sitting, yeah, fine, I'm all for that. But the net effect is, if you think about all the, Amazon was on the internet exemption. GE has just led the world in reading the tax code very, very carefully, having lobbyists put in a few other things. And so a typical general electric tax return will be some 4,000 pages. But honestly and in full legality, at the end of the day, the government owes them money and they don't have to pay. And there are many other corporations that fit this. Well, candidly, if they're not going to pay, and poor people aren't going to pay, then who's left that has money? Small business and rich people. Now, this is another situation where progressive Democrats have missed the boat. Tax the 1%. Well, the 1% gets very angry about that because the 1% is paying tons of taxes right now. They are already covering the tax burden for the United States. Microsoft may have paid nothing, but when Bill Gates comes home sitting in his wonderful, huge house, he has to write a large check. And so will Melinda if they're filing separately. Okay? And so they say, what do you mean I pay more? Look at how much I'm paying, Buster. And they're right. But if you're just something like a ENT surgeon, or you're a divorce lawyer, or you run Sam's Pizza, those guys don't avoid their taxes. And for them, the taxes are a real burden. For a long period of time, no one really noticed this inequity. But there was significant mobilization. And so we talk about how big ideas can change the world and how individuals can change the climate. The no new taxes people, the seeds of the organizations that became the Tea Party. It had other forms. And if you look at the history of conservative politics, there were some training seminars and some fancy places that people went in the 70s where they were setting the seeds for, there's a taxation problem here. Pitching it to exactly the people who would benefit the most, who are being disproportionately hit, and some private corporations who are just fine going with, because if there's anti-taxing, they can go along for the ride. So monopoly capital got huge amounts of extra savings from this movement. As you know, from the Trump tax reform, they got a huge share. But once you got the people with a legitimate interest mobilized, and this works about the same way that leftists organize workers or leftists organize an ethnic group that's being persecuted. When you point out what's being done to them and you show them what can be done, it's exactly the same technique on the other side of the political spectrum. So the equivalent of, quote unquote, the Martin Luther King for anti-tax people were these early training groups. When they became widespread, when the word got out, people organized well, but they told story to people for whom it resonated with their personal experience, and they became radicalized anti-taxers. And remember that the first sign of this was Reagan, but then this would continue to be a meme all through American conservative politics. And there are parallel weaker forms of this in many other countries. Bolsonaro's Brazil is tied to many complex things. It's not just one thing. But Brazilian individuals and corporations really are very, very heavily taxed in Brazil. And some of that went into why let's just get rid of people and put in someone who's going to shrink everything, which Bolsonaro has not done, but then neither did Trump. Okay. But now that you see all that, and the issue is here that what this tends to produce is large-scale deficits. And the plan was they thought that if the deficits would be big enough, this would lead towards crisis cuts, where you could cut things that would seem untouchable. So, for instance, Kansas government, state government, has had unacceptable fiscal crises. So they've had to cut higher education. How bad is bad? At Kansas universities, this year, people were furloughed for 40% of their salary. Now, never mind their salary. We're not going to cry over their salary. They could not enter the university buildings on their days off. They could not use their emails on the days off. So if you're running a chem lab or you're running a cancer experiment, shall we say this might interfere with the effectiveness of your scientific research, let alone even the simple thing of you're just at a smaller college and all you do is teach because you believe in it. But now you can't meet with the students. You can't do all of these things that you would normally do with students. Every aspect of university functioning was collapsed. And how could you do this? Because a fiscal crisis required mandatory emergency measures. And that's kind of how this thing is going to work, is you let the deficit get big enough. Then suddenly there's an emergency, and then you cut all the vital stuff brutally because you have to. And the effects, once you've cut out one lung, one kidney, and most of the large intestines, working quickly without anesthesia, that's a patient who's going to be pretty bad shape when you're done with it. And that's what the fiscal crisis looks like. So back to your historical question, it came from a long-standing historical trend of buying political contributions by letting corporations get away with all the tax stuff they wanted, but still insisting that someone pay and creating someone who is at some stage of the game going to object to this.
So would you say that the United States, and maybe if this doesn't sound right, clean up my definition for me, but would you say the United States is a bit of a plutocracy in that sense, where the big businesses really do have much more control?
How did the current more extreme plutocracy come about because it's worse now than it was. And you're probably aware that you may or may not be aware, but I'll assume you are. Social inequality indicators have gone up dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years. This came largely as a result of financialization. And financialization has its own sad origin. So financialization, if for some reason banking became more important, bankers have a vested interest in financial volatility because that allows for interesting opportunities to bet on derivatives market and bet on financial instruments. It allows for brighter than average financial whizzes to sell an instrument. And also, you're probably aware of, due to our mortgage crisis, a lot of financialization is based on fraud. It is also based on current banking law that for various reasons, we don't want bankers to go broke. Banks fail you at the Great Depression. So banking is insured, but laws were passed that allowed bankers to engage in more and more speculative investments, notably merger and acquisition banks. But that's widespread. So as banks were organizing for maximum profitability on the short term, and bonuses were set up for maximum profitability on the short term, there was a tendency to move into higher and higher yield investments. Everyone knows the higher the yield, the more risk involved. So riskier investments. So the American economy becomes riskier and riskier. Where that works out is if the banks are insured, they're playing the casino game. If they win everything, they keep it, and it goes into private hands. If they lose, they get a bailout, and the taxpayer pays the bet, and the money stays in private hands. So with this financialization, huge amount of fortunes that were being made, where then people could buy whatever politicians they want and set up laws and regulations good for banks. And this is both Democrat and Republican. I will remind you that Hillary Clinton was the Democratic senator from New York. Wall Street is where her home industry, and as her senator, she'd be expected to represent the interests of that. The Clinton Foundation is still based in New York City to this day. Now, it was many people. This was global, it was national. This is not just one individual. But I want to characterize this, not a Republican versus Democrat issue. Even respectable, solid progressives like Charles Schumer on financial regulation that would hit the industries in his home state, they suddenly go soft. So what happens with all this financialization? You have created massive inequality. The finance sector is absolutely interested in low taxes and totally supports all of these low tax initiatives. Okay? The financial sector does not particularly need any of the job manufacturing, building, they don't need more technology, they don't need more of this, they don't need more of that. So they tend to be in favor of cutting government spending. They're certainly not interested in law enforcement, notably on taxes or on financial shenanigans. So they want to see an absolute gutting of that, which of course puts the American and world economy in danger of major economic shutdowns. So the Asian financial crises, the American mortgage crisis, these are global problems producing poverty all over the world. And so you've got these regular shocks coming to the system. I did not mention this before, but you guys can imagine if you want to start an economy, a world system that's going like this and then going like that, a precipitating event can be an economic shock where something hits the economy and doesn't particularly recover. We get shocks all the time, and most we do right with. But shocks are really never good, and unnecessary artificial shocks are even worse. Particularly when, if we all need to cooperate and get along, and then there's a whole bunch of people causing huge financial loss, and everyone is looking for a scapegoat, that doesn't exactly create the warm, fuzzy feelings that leads to society-wide. So in Germany's in the depression, you blame the Jews. Well, you blame the French. The French, there would be some justification for that, but so let's invade the French. Well, that's not such a healthy response. In the 1930s, the Ku Klux Klan was going nuts during the Great Depression. They're going after Italians. They were going after blacks. All sorts of hatred occurs during these downturns. People in struggling Middle Eastern societies, they had their own local crises. Well, they don't understand why it's done, but they know something international is going there. So there's a bunch of Jews in the World Trade Center, and they caused this. One of the easiest ways to prevent that is you just keep everything kind of growing on a slow, steady scheme where everyone's getting rich and standards of living are getting better, but you get these shocks to this. So that financialization has made things much, much worse.
Yeah, and it seems to fly, right in the face of, a growing financial separation, but in society seems to fly right in the face of widespread cooperation, which is one of the main things you said allows civilizations to live. So with that being said, too, I kind of want to get to, you have 3 really interesting points in your book about the things that tend to contribute to the collapses of civilizations or some common trends. So the first one being that standards of living tend to collapse. Could you go into that a little bit and talk about how that manifests itself in some of your examples that you give?
But the same is that we just talked about that a minute ago, and when the economy goes bad, the rich people kind of save themselves and everyone else kind of gets really, really hurt. In the case of ancient Rome, well, we don't have censuses. We don't have GNP statistics for 700 AD, but archaeologists could go and dig up houses and you can see how much material is in the houses. And in the Middle Ages in 700, houses were smaller and had less stuff in them than they would have had if you dig at a comparable site from 200 AD. Now, what does economic collapse look like? It's important to not get carried away with sensational Hollywood ideas of collapse, particularly when things are slow. Imagine, we're not talking about necessarily a huge nuclear fireball destroying everything, or there being no food to eat forever. Imagine an economy that was just stagnant. Nothing really working. Imagine some country that just doesn't grow very much and business conditions are always rotten. Some people would claim that the Ukraines or Belarusias of the world might look that way, the Moldavias. And so what happens is that there's just a lot of unemployment. You can actually look at a lot of the Middle Eastern economies where youth unemployment is like 40%. From ordinary business growth kind of stuff you talk about in Fortune magazine or Business Week. And now take what 40% unemployment looks like for youth and 40% of your kids hanging out in the streets. And 40% of people looking for something they can do to make themselves other than an unemployed bum. Now, what happens to poor people when they can't support themselves? We got 3 options. There may be some others you can think about. They turn to crime. And you probably know of at least one poor person who's turned to crime for economic reasons, right? They, in a not particularly democratic situation, you go to work for a local politician because politicians always have money. They need bodyguards. They need election fixers. If there's someone who has to be dealt with, they deal with them. And so in a place like Uganda, you're talking about warlords with the armies associated with warlords. You get a lot of this in the East Congo. You get a lot of this in the Philippines. You get a lot of this in Honduras. Note that warlord and criminal, organized crime, can be the same people. Not always, but this is a highly overlapping category. Or you can go and you go to school. And sometimes, and I'll give you an example from Cyprus, you go to school because it's all there is, and there's no jobs for you after school. So you set up schools by yourself as a private school, and you got a lot of anger and you got a lot of hatred in you because you're excluded, so there's a scapegoat. So you start creating schools of ethnic hatred. In Cyprus, unemployed Greeks who couldn't get any, they were beautifully educated in Cyprus, had nothing for them. So they formed Hellenic culture, and Cyprus is divided between the Greeks and the Turks. Heavily controlled by the Greeks in the early days. So the Greeks would start creating schools talking about the beauties of Hellenic culture, which is what they studied, and implying that everything Islamic was bad, and to make the world perfect, we need Turks out of here. Turkish culture is dangerous, and everything good should be reserved for Greeks. Late in the game, seeing what was done, and the Turks started to create their own schools. But in all fairness, on that one, the Greeks went first. You find this in Palestine on both sides of the line, where each of the contestants is running schools oriented towards why our culture is great and why we have to wipe out the other folks. So you can see that that kind of unemployment is a feeder for socializing peoples in cultures of fighting, cultures of opposition, and cultures of violence. When you look at a group like ISIS, which Iraq had massive youth unemployment. Iraq was a hopelessly incompetent, intentionally incompetent. No one was really trying. Okay, their government on top was more concerned with lining its own pockets and building any kind of sustainable development, or unsustainable development, just any kind of development. They just didn't care. And you look at some of the Shiite Sunni stuff that was going on. But you take a group like ISIS that shows up in Iraq, and it shows up in Iraq in a place with, out in the West. All the government spending was in Baghdad. And if you lived out in the West, out in the desert, you didn't get squat. No health services, nothing of nothing. You don't have a job. There isn't the slightest prospect of having a job. Everything in Baghdad's chaos. Well, ISIS was both organized criminals. They sold oil and they sold antiquities. They were warlords. They were trying to take over something, create their own caliphate. And they had religious schools that gave you a reason to live, gave you a purpose, gave you a theology, made you a valued person instead of you just being an unemployed thug. If you've ever sat at a restaurant in a poor country and the street kids come to beg and the head waiter goes and he chases them out as worthless street scum, you're unemployed. And when you're unemployed and a street person, you really are quote unquote worthless. And now someone comes and says you have a unique mission. Say people won't respond to that really powerfully. But this now means their unique mission is to destroy. We're not building, we're taking on the other guys. And that now leads to a world filled with violence, a world filled with terrorism, a world filled with ethnic persecution, a world filled with war. There's a famous sociologist of war, Gregory Hooks, who said, and this is quite correct, war is development in reverse. You want to know how that economy will grow? Have an army come through and destroy everything in sight. Have youth not going to schools because they have to be in militias. Have people not starting business because they have to be in militias. Have women who could be planters or who could be starting small businesses or who could double your productivity being kept at home by their husbands and brothers because if they go out, they're going to be raped or killed. So you eliminate half of your economic activity right there. So you're looking at an absolute decline based on military conditions, and these military conditions can be very enduring. The Eastern Congo and the lakes, the area of Rwanda and all of that lakes area has been violent for the last 30 or 40 years. It has no signs of slowing down. Yemen has no signs of slowing down. If someone were to come and ask you to invest in a business in Yemen, would you take them up on it?
No.
That's your problem. So this is where these crises come from. The economic stagnation produces massive conflict, which kills future growth, and you have this giant spiral going down.
Mm-hmm. So then taking that kind of historical framework and looking at it through the lens of like modern United States society, what would you say the number one threat to a collapse of standard of living is to like the modern American?
Just like in health, you don't have to you cover against number one, you cover against the top 12.
Okay.
But among the most important things we need to do, if I had one magic wish with my magic wand, get people to stop undercutting the functionality of government. Get people to pay their taxes and get people not to reject public initiatives that can come from a red state or a blue state. I hate to say it, folks, there really are some people over on the red states and on the Republican side who have some good ideas for some improvement in government, but you would never listen to them in 600 years. Mm-hmm. The automatic assumption is if it comes out from that side, it's worthless. Certainly, we get very frustrated when they reject our ideas as being worthless. Whether or not you like the centrists in Congress not passing certain things that need to be passed, and I have my strong disagreements with some of them, but the spirit of what they're trying to accomplish, of getting people to work together to solve something, is what needs to be done. It's not only by our elected leaders, it's by ourselves. The division problem and the distrust problem is in the population. There's a Japanese statement: when the minds of the people are impure, the land is impure. There is no pure land without pure minds. If the pure citizens wouldn't accept these shenanigans and they demanded people who work together, if the pure citizens were willing to pay for valuable services to see that those services are continued, then everything would start on the positive spiral again. So to fix the government, we have to fix the people. And to fix the people, we have to have people who are willing to contribute and cooperate. If you want the number one thing, you asking for a number one, here's number one that you can put down on a bumper sticker: contribute and cooperate. If we can get people to contribute and cooperate, that is the number one health measure we can take.
Love that.
Yeah. So I know with the widespread cooperation being a key factor, you spoke on when there's a common lack of respect for authority, that's where this can become a problem. And you're stating that we really need to start to cultivate that respect again and maybe that trust. And I know that there's no simple answer to that, but what are some of the things that you think we need to do in order to cultivate that trust for people to contribute and cooperate?
Oh, you guys ask some of the best questions on the planet.
Maybe I can.
Okay, I'll give you an answer. I had to really think about that because no one's ever asked me that extraordinarily intelligent question.
Nick's a hard hitter. You got to look out for that guy.
But I think there's answers.
Good.
Trust comes from appreciation. It is, and what I'm going to give you here, it comes from some Japanese philosophy again. It does not take very much intelligence to find what's wrong with anything. And let's start with ourselves, because we're not going to tell other people to change themselves unless we change ourselves. So try injecting yourself with the drug before you want to administer it to other people. But let's imagine that we had to show people how to become more trusting and accepting. The first thing we have to do is learn how to appreciate what's good rather than see what's wrong. I once had a district attorney explain to me, this is a very spiritual district attorney, but she had to handle some of the biggest cases that the state of California takes, usually very complex ones involving financial shenanigans where the case is very difficult and very hard for the DA to handle, but very consequential as to whether it wins or loses. So she was at the top of the district attorney game. She wasn't just taking parking tickets. And she once said to me, anyone can put together a prosecution. You don't have to be smart at all to see what someone has done is wrong and identify those problems. Very stupid people can identify what's wrong. It takes a much higher grade of intelligence to appreciate what is right, what is working, what is taken for granted. It is harder to appreciate the positive potential that's in a status quo that could be transformed into something very valuable, very worthwhile. It is much harder to build than to destroy. And you have to actively work at not just rejecting things, but think about how could this be saved? How could something that this person is working with, what is in there that's worth preserving that I would want to help this person preserve? What is there that this person is doing that is constructive that I would want to help this person continue with? And then once you can see the legitimate value of what this person is doing, you're willing to help them out. Now, if you get on a soapbox and saying, you need to cooperate, just like no one's going to do that. In fact, I'm pretty sure just I say people should cooperate more. They're not just going to listen to me per se. I'm just a talking head on a podcast. But to a very real extent, people are grateful for when you've helped them and they know that, well, gee, other people give me a lot of problems, but this guy's kind of helpful. He's useful. This is a guy I can trust. He'll do right by me. And so the more we make a point to start doing right and being appreciative of the people around us, including a large number of people different from ourselves, reaching across boundaries, reaching across types, having genuine dialogue, genuine discussion, the kind where you listen, not just where you talk at them, but where you're really listening and sharing. Genuine dialogue with people I don't normally connect with and finding what they have of value and building that up. And just doing this over and over again, building the largest possible web of mutual respect. If you start doing this, other people will do this because you look very good doing this. And as more and more people do this, you get more and more nice people out there who want to be helpful. So you start changing yourself, you start reaching to other people, but it's this constant search for what is worth preserving, what is worth keeping. I'm not here to tear down or critique. I'm here to maintain what's good. And that kind of consciousness can become more widespread. I'll admit it's a challenging question, but it's a doable question. And it's something that everybody can do. You don't need a college education. You don't need a PhD. You don't need money. You don't need whatever the assets are. You don't need a nice suit of clothes. It's something you can just do. Kids can do it. Grandparents do it. Anyone can do it. You can do this while you're a hospital patient. And that, it sounds sappy, but that's the kind of core trust that's needed. And if it changes at the personal level, it'll change at the global level. But if you don't change the personal level first, then the global level is going to do what it's going to do.
Yeah, I'm definitely here. I'm here for the sappiness. I think it's a really resonant point that you make, because in some of the, Nick being obviously much more immersed than myself in the psychological landscape, I've been doing a little research myself into that space. And yeah, the idea of trusting yourself and going out and acting as if you were the person to be trusted, right? And doing that for yourself. And like you mentioned, people will model that. And the difference between having trust in somebody as a naive means of like not really understanding the world versus trusting in somebody as an act of faith, knowing full well that person could hurt you, is a really big distinction. And I think if people are willing to take that trust as an act of faith when they, reach out to somebody else with a positive mindset, they're probably going to get something pretty astounding in return. It's that like karmic effect, I think.
Yeah. And some of this is cognitive. It's difficult to just say, I'm going to be trusting, because then that's a little bit like bend over and prepare to be kicked. Okay. There's another story. If it's an intellectual matter, looking at what these people are doing and understanding it and seeing something that's legitimately good. So not trying to, to drink the happy Kool-Aid. Hey, everything's wonderful. But a cold, sober, realistic of what is in here that's actually worthwhile and worth building from. I mean, here's a stereotype. I'm not saying it's necessarily the one you'd want to go with first, but many conservative people are concerned about liberty. Well, I'm concerned about liberty too, particularly since I'm the kind of person who, if there's the wrong kind of government, they could lock up. Okay? But very often when you take about what people are concerned about it, you talk about a guy and, oh my God, this guy goes to the gun shows and he shoots this, he's got this giant collection of guns. Well, he's also a hunter. And as a hunter, he cares about conservation because this is the lake where he likes to hunt. Well, to some extent, regardless of what one thinks about guns, and I'll put that as a side issue because that's a flashpoint issue. But we can all agree, regardless of whether it's global warming or not, this guy's lake should probably be preserved. We probably don't want a Walmart next to this guy's lake. And so you look for the little things where and so if you listen enough to what they're doing, someone's got something that's genuinely bona fide. But if you're stupid, you won't see it. The smarter you are, the more you'll see what could be built with this. Anyone ever see those cooking shows where they sabotage cooking shows where I give you something almost impossible to work with? So here is a completely frozen steak, and here is way too old tomatoes. What can you do with this? And they've got to do something, but the cooks are really, really clever, and they actually make dishes that are actually, the ones that win make dishes that are actually good. The ones that aren't so good, they can't get over what they've been handled. This is what our lives are like. We are in that cooking show. It's called The World. And we're handled all of these rotten ingredients, which something can be done. And actually, this rotten milk is the basis for an amazing blue cheese. Let's do it.
Yeah. So that was a great standard of living collapse summary. I think we did it justice. So I'm going to move on to the second one, and that's the disappearance of technology, and
oh my God,
how big of an issue that could be for our society. And I want to throw in the idea, because we had what may or may not have been a close call lately with something like a Carrington event, a solar flare that hurts technology and potentially temporarily wipes it out.
Sure.
So could you maybe give us your quick take on what technological disappearance?
You don't need the heavy science fiction to have technological. Here's two technological issues that everyone knows about. One's flamingly obvious and one's not. You're going to stop global warming, and people aren't going to cut back on their habits. You're just going to have to get tech fixes for the disasters. The fish are dying. You have to learn how to farm fish. You have to learn how to farm fish that don't have any special problems associated with farmed fish. Okay? You're going to run out of oil? All right, you're going to have to find something you can use for fuel. To give you a good example of actually a constructive thing that's already happened, people were concerned about, never mind deforestation for biodiversity. I'm a paper executive. I just want to make sure there's enough trees for paper. Well, say what you will, the paper industry's done a good job at presenting harvestable, sustainable forests of trees that grow up. You can cut down for paper, replant them, and keep it going. The technology never existed before. It's not perfect. It's got its problems. It was better than chopping everything down and not knowing what your next move would be. So we make progress with technology. I'll also mention our economic growth depends on technology, because what happens when people run out of things to invent? History. The American manufacturing boom, we were mostly an agricultural country. You know, we had textile factories in New England. That's nice. But England and Germany, they were the big people. We were a place that grew cotton and grain. Yeah. Well, America turns into a manufacturing superpower about the time of Big Steel. And actually, Germany does the same. So England used to be the king. Then the powers in the early 20th century that would end up fighting a war are the US and Germany, the two big steel inventors. Unfortunately, once they build, and you build steel, and there's an economic boom that comes with turning everything steel. Wooden boats become steel boats. Well, hey, wooden tools become steel boats. Buildings based on stone and wood become skyscrapers with steel frames. And all of the economic growth of the early 20th century was taking things that hadn't been steel and making them steel. Well, ultimately, people ran out of transitions that they could do. They had made all those substitutions. When that happened, it happened earlier in Europe than it did in the United States. Europe, Great Depression starts in the 1920s because they didn't want to rebuild all their buildings skyscraper style. So they ran out of things they could do with steel earlier. Their economy goes sour in 1920. We're sticking up skyscrapers all over the place. So we have the roaring 20s, but that starts to run out in 1930s. And again, the only thing that's keeping us going to the 30s, the only industry that kept us alive was telephones. That was the industry that was still alive while everything else was dead. But you now see my story. You got to have some kind of a new product or else you got problems. Right now, when you run out, you need something new. And what saved the steel economy was something no one was paying attention to. Pittsburgh, big steel. Love it. Chicago, big steel. Love it. Detroit, well, that's like Toledo with these other places. You have minor stuff that helps. Nothing serious happens in Detroit. So you have an engineer, you may have heard of him, called Henry Ford. who had gotten fired from 3 other engineering jobs because he really wasn't good at the stuff they had. And they put him now in the stupid industry making toys for rich people, these carriages that go with no horses. They're insanely expensive. Well, you know the rest is history, right? He figures out a way to make cars cheap enough and fast enough to be a mass product. Everyone starts buying it. And the cars get better and better and better. They speed up. They get better engines. They don't need a crank. They start getting power steering. And with cars, you now need to have a gasoline industry because you need fuel. And you got to have roads for the driving. So we now start paving the whole road with highways and concrete streets everywhere. And my God, now you have a car. You don't have to live in the center city. You can now live out in the suburbs. If you live in the suburbs, you can build all these houses. But if they'll need a place to shop, so you need shopping malls. But oh my God, they're having all of these accidents. So we need an insurance business. But now that they're out there, they can drive. Well, they could go to the movies, or we could have a restaurant because they could drive 30 miles to the restaurant. So I could have a fish restaurant and there'd be enough people to go. So you suddenly see that there's this giant economic explosion of all of the new ideas that people are getting once you tell them you've got a car. And the 1940s, 50s, 60s are based on everyone building these new inventions and new products based on the fact that a car makes it all possible. Well, what happened is that the car goes stagnant by the late 60s. The last things they put, there's the convertible, which sold a lot of them. They realized it's dangerous, so they stopped. Power steering and power brakes. Then there'll be no more innovations in cars until the 1990s when they invent the SUV. With cars being stagnant, people stop buying new cars. And that gives you the recession of the 70s and 80s. Right now, our society is based on internet, personal computer, software. Everyone went explosive because, my God, I make the computer smaller, it's a PC, it's a laptop. I make it even smaller, it's a phone. I make it smaller and high-powered enough for a lot of graphics, it's a game console. And of course, all of those industries come out of innovations based on that. Well, just as they ran out of industry innovations in auto, they ran out of innovations in steel. At some point, you run out of innovations in software and small-scale computer industries. Remember that steel got saved by a guy in a nutty city looking at something that no one thought would matter. Auto got saved by internet, and internet came from the Defense Department needing a protocol to move large data sets from one university computer to another. How do we do that on phone lines? Oh, we could move it to the phone lines and it'd switch here and switch there. And you could actually kind of instantaneously move the data set. So that's the basis. That's BitNet or ARPANET. There was a couple of different names before it became internet. And then everything else fell from the fact that you can now move huge amounts of data efficiently on phone lines. But you can now see where I'm coming from. When your economy runs out of technological innovation, you're looking at a recession and a depression. There is no guarantee that a big innovation is coming. There is no guarantee that that innovation is based in the United States of America. Whatever country gets it becomes the dominant power for the next 30 to 40 years. If it's China, it's China. If it's Russia, it's Russia. If it's France, it's France. You can now see that if you either care about saving the world from ecological destruction, which is the first thing we talked about, or you want to keep the economy whole, you need to keep innovation coming and technology coming. And a technological edge that was good for 30 or 40 or even a century can run out. Reminder, England was the dominant technological power of the 19th century. They invented the factory. Some cool industrial revolution. We're rich. They invented the railroad. Oh my God, everyone's got to have a railroad. We're rich. The railroad was their last big invention. And then all the other inventions occurred in the United States and Germany. And England turned from the dominant world power to a secondary consultant with an economy that was struggling compared to that of America and Britain and Germany. So the fact that you've always had technology does not mean that this is your entitlement because you're so smart. And Stanford will always crank out great things. They won't. Unless you keep that constant investment in education and research running, your old inventions will run out. And then you got to hope that a wave comes that allows you to pick it up. So education is fundamental for long-term societal well-being. It's not optional, it's mandatory, and it's one of the biggest things you can deal with.
Now, do you think this needs to be revolutionary rather than evolutionary? Can an existing technological innovation that has gone stagnant can new life be breathed into it and it have the same effect, or does it have to kind of be this new major national need for adoption kind of a?
It's every technology is different. And remember, things that people have contempt for turn out to be winners. No one thought that horseless carriages were going to be anything worth serious thought. No one thought that data transfer protocols would be worth serious thinking. And surprisingly, the Industrial Revolution came from just the kind of same old that you're talking about, because everyone thinks about the Industrial Revolution as steam power. They invented these marvelous steam engines. In fact, the original factories that were the super productive bases of growth had no new invention from a scientific standpoint. What they did was they took the same spinning wheels and the same looms that were in people's houses, and they put them in one building. Well, why do you put them in one building? Because people working in their house would drink. People working in their house wouldn't work that hard. They'd take time off. People working in their house, because they were poorer than the merchant, and you give them all this cloth to make clothes for lords and ladies, and they have a child who's shivering in the cold, they cut the cloth to kind of steal a bunch of it because they need to make something for their kid. So, but what happened is that these old house workers were amazingly inefficient and inexpensive. And so the invention of the factory was part of the language, one son of a, fill in the blank for son of a, putting everyone in a factory, and I hire a real mean guy to watch everyone and make them work constantly, and they're not allowed to drink and they're not allowed to steal, and they have to keep working. Well, that and that alone, like dectupled productivity and produced an industrial revolution. And the key point for what you're saying is that it was an idea that had been around for a million times, and everyone knew that if you have a boss, you work harder. This is not a breakthrough invention, but someone actually went ahead and did it. So some inventions are out of no place and are exotic. Some inventions are right in front of you. It doesn't matter what they are as long as someone invents them.
Yeah, I think to add a layer onto Brendan's question, I'm curious what your thoughts are about like this move towards electric vehicles and having that be something that is really present now.
It's the hallmark of a breakthrough invention is that nobody saw it coming. Okay? Almost by definition, it's a surprise. Because also, you don't even know this is coming out of the United States. So what's going to happen is by the time the next big thing comes into the next big. So, this is a little bit, I can imagine this was a stock picking show. Well, you know as well as I know, there's a lot of people trying to get their heads on the next big thing, and everyone's full of rumors and how good, and for the guy who claims that he can pick all this stuff, well, how come he has to appear on TV and radio shows and he's not as rich as Warren Buffett just sitting off his millions? Nobody knows how to pick what these winners are. But you're assuming in these questions that you have a winner. There's a famous line from Tennessee Williams' play. I've always relied on the kindness of strangers. And that's a lady who has no capacity for taking care of herself and goes from one economic desperation to the other and hoping a man will pick her up and treat her nice. And of course, there's no guarantee that on any given night she goes home with a sweetheart as opposed to a psycho killer and that she's going to be taken care of. Well, our economy has always been dependent on the kindness of inventors. And there's no guarantee that we're going to get one. You invest in as much education as you can to increase your odds. And then lo and behold, someone invents a cancer-reducing hat. And we're off to the races. As it happened, the cancer-inducing hat is coming out of Morocco. Deal with it.
All right. Beautiful cap on number 2. Now, the third point you make in your book is that crime, warfare, and violence increase.
Oh, yes.
So maybe if you could give us a quick synopsis on what historically we've seen in that aspect, and then we'll loop it back into modern times again.
Okay. Every single major fall is associated with in all sorts of crime and violence. Think about the miraging hordes of the early Middle Ages as Goths and Ostrogoths and Huns, and everyone comes through wrecking and burning. And then keep in mind, Northern Europe, which does not see most of the improvements that, say, Italy and the Mediterranean get, well, the Vikings are there wrecking everything in sight. Okay, so once the warfare is there, it's extremely deleterious. And I think we've already talked about some of the things that cause warfare, like some of those. We've talked about economic crises causing warfare. We've talked about the creation of ideological mentalities of us versus them and distrust, such as we saw in the Greek and Cyprus situation. But that basically leads to the arming of people. In Cyprus, it has not turned super violent, it's just civil hostile. With ISIS, it was extremely violent. With Lord's Resistance Army, that was a Christian terrorist group in Uganda. The kind that would chop off limbs or make kids rape their mothers. Extremely violent. It's certainly plenty violent in India versus Pakistan, where what's called communal violence is when one of the groups comes and attacks the other, burning down buildings and killing people. That's actually a fairly common occurrence in India, ethnic communal violence. There are all of these, I don't have to, among the forces that I've not talked about, that above and beyond what I've talked about, there's new. One of the number one causes of ongoing rural violence is landlessness. And I talk about this a lot in the book. Landlessness can be caused by innocent things. If the population grows too fast, well, not everyone can be on the land, so population growth, you're just going to squeeze some people off and become landless. However, right now, the world is experiencing a global land grab. The Chinese, the Europeans, the Americans are going all over the global south buying up land for either development projects, real estate projects, or speculation. And you often get rid of, people who had their own farm that they lived on, their families lived on for 5 generations, they're off that now because we're putting in a palm oil plantation. We're off that now because we're putting in a dam. We're off that now because you're on the edge of a city and I want to put in a shopping center. Almost always in these transfers, we found that even when they're given sometimes they're not given attractive terms. People who refuse to leave, you use gangsters to get them out. Or you use what are called paramilitaries. Paramilitaries are cops and soldiers working off the books, often with civilians, who do the dirty jobs that you couldn't do legally. Okay. Another term for them is death squads. In India, they're called land mafias. In America, we don't have these. In the global south, these are absolutely rampant. A lot of these death squads were the basis for the political support for Bolsonaro in Brazil. In Brazil, they're called militias. And what they do, I'll give you an example of how they might operate in Central America. Someone wants to put in a plantation. The locals don't want to sell because the terms they'd have to go live in a slum if they left, while they get all of this food and life is wonderful. It's every place they remember. They won't leave. So the truck comes through with the guys with the submachine guns, just going through to remind you that they're in town. In front of your house, someone puts up a leaflet with a skull and a crossbow and talk about enemies of progress. And enemies of progress will be destroyed. Now, if you get the point, the guy comes to talk to you and you're willing to do a deal, and maybe you aren't going to hold out. He doesn't offer you the special deal he did anymore, but you just take it. If you really stick it out, they will come. And so there's a scholar named Jasmine Ristoff in Canada who has these long lists of the assassinations, these long lists of the rapes, the long lists of the murders, the long list of the forcible mass evacuations. And her specialty is Colombia and Central America, where this is widespread. When they become landless, they become more violent. For a very simple reason. Oh, I'm so unhappy. Well, that's obvious. But I'll talk about a very simple factor. Farmers with their own land have to stay put on the farm taking care of the farm. So they're busy. I've got to plant, I've got to harvest, I've got to irrigate, I've got to weed, I've got to this, I've got to that. So they get up every day and they've got a farm they've got to take care of. Now they're migratory labor. They don't have to be anywhere until harvest time. At harvest time, they've got to pick the crops. Except for that, they got nothing to do. Someone comes along, giving you an option for something to do. Maybe it's a progressive group, and we're going to fight for land justice, or we're going to, you're an Indian, you were kicked out, we're going to fight for Indian rights. Maybe it's a drug lord. Maybe it's someone who wants to start a nice little ethnic war. Maybe it's another paramilitary group. The guy couldn't help but notice how well dressed and how well fed the guys who kicked him out are. He knows what side everything's on. If you can't beat him, join him. One way or the other, people who are engaged in peaceful, constructive activity are now involved in killing for a living. Macho groups like that don't treat their women very well. So in the old days, when the farm was going on, well, the woman used to make these traditional dolls that she would sell for the markets, or even a special one she'd make for the tourists, kind like the Americans want. Or she'd make some of her special jellies, and she would sell those. Actually, she got a little bit clever, and she's actually now running around, and she organizes certain kinds of other small activities. Okay, so they do something where they deliver. She goes down to the city, gets veterinary medicines, and she sells them to people for their horses and their animals. So she's got this little enterprise going. Now that the militia's involved and she's not doing anything, we traffic her. Take my daughter for a good price, I send her down, and we send her down to the city where we know what she's expected to do. The whole nature of gender relations changes with super macho men for whom rape is a natural natural way of doing business. And then think what it does psychologically. If you're a girl whose own parents sold her off, think about what kind of a parent you're going to be. If you're a kid who was brought up by his dad that it's all about toughness and fighting, and with the implied thing that you're not going to live past 20, but you need to die with glory, what does this mean when you capture someone, and how are you going to treat them? What does this mean about you thinking about, never mind even going to school, where the teacher wouldn't respect, you've been taught you need respect, and the teacher doesn't respect you, so you're not going to do that. What does it even mean for, say, starting some kind of a small business in the city that slowly grows, that turns, starts into kind of a bakery, and then it's a real bakery, and then before you know it, it's known for its local pastry that's the city specialty. That's something that a lower class kid could have done. But you're not doing that if you're in a paramilitary squad. So all of this thick texture of constructive activities that everyone does that builds things up for the future is now destroying things in the present. And you create a psychology where they teach this to their kids, who teach to their kids, so people become less entrepreneurial, more violent, less tolerant, more vicious. That is how long-term generations of violence get created.
And yeah, just listening to you break that down makes so much sense. Like, these layers just go on to one another, and this cycle just keeps going. But kind of now that we've hit on the 3 points, the title of your book is All Societies Die, How to Keep Hope Alive. I'm curious about like where you're at with the sense of hope for our society.
Sense of hope.
Today.
First of all, no one wants this to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The more we, just like no one wants to die, but you don't start taking the health issues into account. As soon as you start thinking about how to keep yourself healthy, many people will come to many different solutions. I may be eating all meat because I'm on a special no carbs diet. You're on a all gluten-free vegan diet. It doesn't really matter. We're both doing something to keep ourselves alive, and it's better than we had before. The exact details don't matter. Well, the same thing kind of works in social stuff. Once people are determined to keep the project going, they think long-term as opposed to short-term advantage. That helps. Certainly right now the focus is Reds beating Blues or Blues beating Reds. And we're all preparing for 2022 and 2024. That's your only focus. We ain't saving anything. But above and beyond that, a lot of it's what we talked about before. Creating meaningful dialogues with people. And I think the general shorthand that I use in the book, lots of chapters, I can make this complicated. But if you want it just on something you could get tattooed on one arm, create the largest web of cooperation possible. Reach out to as many people as you know, help them out. Talk to other people about the benefits of the cooperation. Specifically, if you want more specific stuff than just cooperation, we have to be willing to prepare science, to defend science. We have to be willing to defend education as being critical. Science is critical, education is critical. We have to have people willing to make sacrifices for the public good. Pay your taxes. Drive at 55 if it uses less gasoline. People who are really willing to contribute to the public good. And we need to somewhat tell each other the story. We may see the good and stuff. We're all about critiquing everything. We need to start putting out more material that's praising things that are legitimately good. Often what you can do, it's a little bit like advertising. Instead of advertising, buy Glitz Seltzer. Shop at this supermarket, it's wonderful. Shop at that supermarket, it's wonderful. Okay? Here's your beer ad. But start thinking about the things that we promote, even if you will, I forget what they call a public service ad. Make yourself a public service ad for the things that really deserve praise, that are really worth getting people to buy into. We need cooperation. We need to protect government. Government does too many valuable things at Lowe's. We need to protect science and technology. We need to understand the values of the group of the person you're not talking to. So you need to be a diplomat going between groups, building bridges between groups. And we need to value society itself, civilization itself. Get a deep appreciation for the amazing things that were produced between 1350 and now, the marvelous things that are in our world that will be lost. We live lives of incredible privilege, of incredible prosperity, of incredible well-being. Most poor people in our society have access to the homeless people don't. But most poor people, even if they live in a terrible house, have access to a flush toilet and can take a hot shower whenever they want to. In history, most people did not have access to a flush toilet and could not have taken a hot shower. Developing a deep sense for how valuable what we have is and how worthwhile it is, instead of complaining about this, complaining about that. And then making a commitment to preserve what needs to be preserved. The old Joni Mitchell song, "You Don't Know What You've Got Till It's Gone"? I think that's Joni Mitchell. If I'm wrong, you can blip that part of the tape. But "You don't know what you've got till it's gone" is a very real thing. And we're going to be very sad when we cross over a transition point. And we're looking back on this, a golden age that we didn't recognize at the time.
I'm going to add a music reference to your music reference, and it's going to relate back to what we were talking about earlier. And that's the Michael Jackson line of starting with the man in the mirror, right?
Exactly.
Like organizing yourself towards this goal is the fastest way to get the community to orient towards the same goal.
This guy understands my book. Well, this entire interview team has been amazing, but you understand the larger principles profoundly. Personal transformation comes first. But along with a commitment to action, you just don't want to sit in your bathtub staring at your navel all day. Change yourself and then get up and do something. Everyone will do something else. It's not going to be cookie cutter. Everyone, when they think about their situation, will have a unique personal mission that they can do better than anyone else. And everyone has it, from the oldest people, the sickest people, people who are stuck in wheelchairs, people are stuck wherever. There still is something almost anyone can do that will improve this. And the more you find your personal mission for what you can preserve based on changing yourself first and learning to appreciate the people around you and the good things in the world you live in. Following exactly the advice that Brendan set up, that's going to make a huge difference. And tell your story to the world. Talk to as many people as you can. There's a famous line I closed the book with, but it's a real one. It's one worth repeating. It's from the Japanese philosopher Daisaku Ikeda. Hope is a decision.
I think that's a great cap for the interview. That's where I feel so good about ending it there.
Yeah. I think you've laid these concepts out and just kind of the timeline of what's been going on so beautifully, and it just makes so much sense to me. So thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us. And yeah, for anybody listening, All Societies Die, How to Keep Hope Alive is Dr. Cohn's book. If you want to check it out, we'll have the link in our bio. And yeah, thanks again, Dr. Cohn.
Thanks again. You guys give remarkable interviews, some of the best.
Thank you. Thank you.